You think you can fix this? Let's see what you've got. The words cut through the air like a whip, cold and cruel. Sarah Montgomery's voice echoed across the sterile conference room, a sharp contrast to the tense silence that had settled among the gathered engineers. A room full of degrees from the best schools in the country, all turned toward the one man who didn't belong, James Parker. James stood there, his hands trembling, but his face was calm. He'd been here before, in moments where the odds were stacked against him. But this was different. The towering figure of Sarah, arms crossed tightly, was practically daring him to fail. Her cold smile didn't even try to hide her disdain. She had no respect for him. No respect for the years of experience he brought, earned through sweat, not textbooks. Her challenge hung in the air, the threat of public humiliation now dangling like a guillotine blade. And the worst part? She was recording. It wasn't just about the engine. It was about her pride. About proving, once and for all, that someone like James, someone without an Ivy League degree, couldn't possibly measure up. The electric car prototype they had been working on for weeks had failed spectacularly. And, as the lead engineer, Sarah Montgomery had already decided, if James couldn't fix it, it would prove everything she had ever believed about people like him. He had no right to be here. He wasn't supposed to be in this room. Not in her world. But James wasn't like the others. With his calloused hands and dirt-streaked overalls, James had spent the past 2 decades working with his hands, taking apart engines and putting them back together. While the experts at the table sat behind computer screens and discussed theories, James had rebuilt broken engines in the heat of the moment, under pressure, with nothing but his instincts and experience to guide him. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. But this time, he would prove them wrong. He took a slow step toward the table, locking eyes with Sarah, feeling the weight of the room on his shoulders. Her smirk was growing, but he wasn't looking at her. He was focused on the prototype before him. The twisted metal, the broken sensors. There was something here. Something wrong. Everyone was waiting for him to fail. But he wasn't going to. He knelt down beside the engine, pulling the scattered parts closer, examining each one. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Sarah seemed to hold her breath, watching with a smug confidence. But James had been in worse situations. He had worked in warehouses where no one cared to listen. He had fixed things with scraps. This wasn't new to him. Slowly, methodically, he began to trace the problem. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on his back, but all he could focus on was the engine in front of him. His fingers danced across the wires and sensors, and his mind raced through possibilities. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a random error. It was sabotage. Sabotage. His gut twisted as he found the first clue, a broken wire, deliberately cut in a way that wasn't accidental. A deliberate flaw. James froze for a moment, his pulse quickening. He reached deeper into the system. Another cut. Another malfunction. Carefully planned. The engine wasn't just broken. It was designed to fail. And in that moment, the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't a simple failure. This was sabotage. Someone didn't want him to succeed. As he pulled out the last broken piece, he glanced up at Sarah, who was still watching him with that sickening smile. He felt a surge of anger, but he kept his focus. She thought he couldn't do it. He would show her. 5 days, James, Sarah had said earlier. You have 5 days to fix what we couldn't. If you fail, we all get to laugh at your expense. If you succeed, I'll personally offer you a real job here, with real benefits. You'll get the title. You'll get the recognition. But, her smile widened, I'm guessing that's not going to happen, is it? Her words still stung. But now, James could see it clearly. This wasn't about him fixing the engine. This was a game of power. She wanted to prove that someone like him didn't belong. Someone with no degrees, no fancy titles, just a guy who knew how to fix things. But it was going to backfire. Because, in the end, it wasn't degrees that made an engineer. It was the ability to solve problems, to think outside the box, to make something work when everyone else was too busy talking. As James carefully removed the last faulty piece, he couldn't help but feel the eyes on him. He was under the microscope, his every move watched by those who hoped he'd fail. But what they didn't know was that he had already seen through Sarah's plan. He wasn't just fixing the engine. He was uncovering a conspiracy. "What's wrong with you? Don't you know where to start?" The mocking voice of Mark, Sarah's assistant, cut through the silence, snapping James out of his thoughts. James didn't look up. He didn't need to. The insults didn't matter. His hands moved faster now, driven by something deeper than anger, driven by the need to prove he belonged here. It wasn't just about the engine anymore. It was about proving them all wrong. "I'll fix it," James muttered under his breath. "And when I do, you'll wish you never underestimated me." James wiped the sweat from his brow, but his focus didn't waver. The engine in front of him was a mess, but it wasn't the kind of mess that happened by accident. It was deliberate. It was sabotage. He didn't know who was behind it yet, but he knew one thing for sure: someone didn't want him to succeed. The cuts in the wiring, the broken components that didn't make sense, it was too perfect. Too planned. "I can fix this," James muttered under his breath, his hands moving quickly as he disassembled more of the engine. The clock was ticking. 5 days. He had 5 days to prove that he could do what an entire team of engineers couldn't. But as the hours passed and the team watched from the sidelines, the stakes felt much higher than just fixing an engine. This was personal. The whispers around the workshop were growing louder. Every step he took, every wire he touched, seemed to fuel the growing tension. People watched, waiting for him to mess up. Waiting for him to fail. But James wasn't thinking about the spectators. He was thinking about the job. The task at hand. He knew how to fix things. It was in his blood. "Are you really going to try this again, James?" A voice broke his concentration. He didn't need to look up. Mark. Mark, the guy who was always lurking around, hovering in the background like a shadow, waiting to see if James would fall flat on his face. He was the first one to mock James, to feed Sarah's narrative that someone like him didn't belong. James paused for a moment, then shot a look up at him. There was a sly grin on Mark's face, as if he already knew the outcome. It wasn't just the engine he was rooting for James to fail at. It was his entire presence here. But James didn't answer him. He just turned back to the engine and got to work. If Mark wanted to keep playing his games, that was on him. James had more important things to focus on. Hours passed. As James worked, he realized the sabotage was more sophisticated than he had initially thought. The wiring wasn't just cut, it was burned. The parts had been tampered with to make it look like a natural breakdown, but no one in the room, not Sarah, not her team, would have noticed the subtle manipulation. They were too busy with their egos to see the truth. As the workshop started to wind down for the evening, James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He had found something. A pattern. It wasn't just one error, there was a series of tiny but deliberate mistakes, too coordinated to be a mistake. "Hey, James." James turned to see Clara Lee, a fellow engineer, standing in the doorway. She'd been quiet for the past couple of days, mostly keeping to herself. But there was something different in her expression now. Something curious. "You look like you found something," Clara said, walking toward him. James nodded, pushing the engine aside to make room on the workbench. "It's sabotage," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Sabotage? Are you sure?" "Yeah," James replied, pointing to the wiring. "Look at this." The cuts aren't random. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just a failure, it was planned. Clara knelt beside him, inspecting the damage. Her eyes widened as she saw the same thing James had. The pattern wasn't just suspicious, it was calculated. "You're right," she said, glancing at him with a mix of shock and disbelief. "But why? Why would someone sabotage a project like this?" James leaned back, taking a deep breath. It didn't make sense. Why go through the trouble of sabotaging an engine that could change the world of self-driving cars? What was the real goal behind it? Clara stayed late that evening, helping James go through the engine part by part. It didn't take long before they found more evidence, deliberate tampering, adjustments that didn't just happen by accident. As the night wore on, they pieced together a picture. A bigger picture. "James, I think I know what's going on," Clara said after a long pause. She sounded almost nervous, but there was no turning back now. James turned to her, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" "This sabotage, it's not just about the engine," Clara said, her voice shaking with realization. "It's part of a pattern. A series of failures, all affecting projects led by engineers who don't fit the company's profile." James frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated. "I've been in this company long enough to know that some people have a way of pushing others out. People who don't look like they belong here. I've seen it happen before. People who are different, who don't have the right background, they get demoted. Their work gets undermined. And when they fail, it's all part of the plan." James' stomach dropped. He had seen it. The dismissive glances from some of the engineers. The way Sarah had always spoken down to him, as if he were less than them. "You think this has happened before?" James asked. Clara nodded grimly. "Yes, I do." James stood up, his mind racing. The sabotage, the pattern, the deliberate undermining, it was all starting to make sense. But the next question was the hardest: who was behind it? The next day, James walked into the office with a different resolve. He knew the sabotage wasn't just a personal attack on him anymore. It was a systemic issue. A culture of discrimination that had been festering for far too long. He gathered all the evidence he could, hoping to confront Sarah directly. He couldn't just let this go. The company had a responsibility to its people, to the talent, regardless of their background. James didn't wait for the right moment. He didn't need to. The sooner he confronted Sarah, the sooner he could end this. "Sarah, we need to talk." Sarah looked up from her desk, surprised. She hadn't expected him to come in like this, uninvited, with such a serious expression. "About what?" she asked, her tone sharp but calm. "About the sabotage," James said, his voice steady. "I know what you did. I know what's been happening here." For the first time in days, Sarah's confident smirk faltered. She stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Yes, you do," James replied. "You've been part of this. You've been sabotaging projects led by engineers who don't fit the company's mold. And I've got the proof." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanor replaced with a flash of nervousness. "You can't prove anything," she said, her voice suddenly cold. James placed the evidence on her desk. The pictures, the emails, the detailed records. "Everything. I already have," James said. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The next morning, James stood outside Sarah's office, his heart pounding. He had everything he needed, proof that the sabotage wasn't just a one-time event. It was a pattern. A carefully orchestrated effort to push certain people out. As he pushed open the door to Sarah's office, the moment he entered, he knew it was going to be more complicated than he thought. The way she was sitting behind her desk, with that defensive posture, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't going to back down easily. "I told you," James, you don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. Her usual calm confidence was gone, replaced by something colder. You've got nothing to back this up. James wasn't intimidated. I have everything I need, he replied calmly, stepping further into the office. You've been sabotaging these projects, deliberately setting them up to fail. And it's not just about this engine. It's about people, engineers who don't fit your idea of what belongs in this company. I have emails, photos, and records. I have proof. Sarah's eyes flickered to the pile of documents on her desk, documents that he had left there yesterday. She hesitated for a second, clearly weighing her options. You're making a huge mistake, James, she said, her voice low but sharp. This isn't what you think. You're out of your depth. But James had heard enough. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't even about the engine. This was about exposing a culture of exclusion, a toxic environment where people like him, people with real experience, were pushed aside because they didn't fit the company's narrow, self-congratulatory mold. You think I'm out of my depth? James replied, his voice steady, even though his chest tightened with anger. No, I'm not. You're the one who's been hiding behind your little schemes. Trying to keep others down. Well, that's over now. Just then, Clara walked into the room, her expression resolute. She hadn't said much during the previous days, but now it was clear she was ready to back James up. James is right, Sarah, Clara said, her voice clear and calm. This has been going on for too long. People who don't have the right background have been getting pushed aside, and it's time to end that. Sarah looked between the two of them, her jaw tightening. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then she stood up, her gaze hardening. You think you can just come in here and make accusations? She asked, the edge in her voice unmistakable. You think you can destroy everything I've built here? James didn't flinch. No, Sarah. I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to fix it. The confrontation had escalated quickly, but the truth was out now. James had proof and he wasn't going to back down. But what happened next wasn't something he could have anticipated. Just as Sarah was about to respond, Thomas Crawford, the CEO of the company, walked into the office. His presence alone made the tension in the room palpable. What's going on here? Thomas asked, his voice firm but curious as he took in the scene. The atmosphere in the room shifted when Thomas Crawford walked in. The CEO's presence, his calm yet powerful demeanor, immediately commanded attention. James, Clara, I assume you have a good reason for this confrontation. Thomas said, eyeing Sarah, who was visibly uncomfortable now. Yes, we do, James replied, stepping forward, his resolve unwavering. He wasn't about to back down now. This isn't just about one engine failing. This is about a pattern of sabotage, a deliberate effort to undermine engineers who don't meet some unspoken standard. Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Sarah's face turned pale. James, this is completely false, Sarah began, but her voice was faltering now. She knew this was bigger than just a small mistake. Clara spoke next, her voice clear. We have proof, Thomas. I've been with this company long enough to see the pattern. Projects led by people of color, people from different backgrounds, have repeatedly failed under suspicious circumstances. And I think it's time we talk about why. Thomas turned to Sarah, his face hardening. Is this true? Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of the situation was sinking in. The room was heavy with the truth. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath and spoke, her voice now soft but filled with anger. Yes, it's true. I didn't think anyone would notice. But it's been happening for years. The company needs to maintain a certain standard, and some people just don't fit that mold. I didn't mean for it to get this far. James stared at her, disbelief flooding through him. You've been sabotaging people's careers because they didn't fit your ideal. You've destroyed lives to protect your position. It's not like that, Sarah said weakly, but the damage was already done. I did it because I thought it was for the best. This company needed to succeed. Thomas's expression darkened. I built this company, Sarah. And I never, ever imagined it could be tainted by something like this. Sarah stood frozen, the truth crashing down on her. She had thought she could get away with it. But now, there was no escape. This company is about innovation, about diversity, about progress, Thomas continued, his voice stern. And it's time we correct the course. Sarah's downfall was swift. Within hours, an internal investigation was launched. The evidence James and Clara had gathered was undeniable. Emails were uncovered, as well as documents showing a clear pattern of sabotage and systemic discrimination. The truth couldn't be hidden anymore. Sarah was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Mark, her loyal assistant, was also implicated and placed on leave as well. Both of them would face an official inquiry, and both were removed from any future company decisions. For the first time, James felt like he could breathe. He had done it. He had fought against the system that had tried to push him out, and he had won. But even as the pieces of the puzzle were being put together, James knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done to fix the culture at Innovative Automotive, to ensure that no one else would have to fight the same battle he did. The fallout from Sarah's confession was swift, like a storm tearing through the company's rigid structure. Employees who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices. Conversations that had been hushed in corners of the office now filled the open air, as the truth about the sabotage was laid bare. James had done more than just fix an engine. He had uncovered a systemic issue that had been festering under the surface for years. The company, once full of pride in its innovation and progress, now had to face the fact that it had been complicit in a culture of exclusion. But change was coming, and James wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by. James, can we talk? Clara's voice interrupted his thoughts. She had been quiet for the last few days, allowing James to lead the charge in exposing the corruption. James looked up from the desk where he had been reviewing emails. Yeah, come in. Clara stepped into his office, her expression serious. I know you're focused on the bigger picture here, but I wanted to check in. What happens now? James exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Now, we fix this company. We build something better. Clara nodded. It's going to be a long road, though. A lot of people are going to fight it. James knew she was right. Not everyone would be on board with the changes. Sarah had supporters, and so did Mark. The old guard wasn't going to give up their influence easily. Yeah, but if we don't try, it'll never change, he said, his voice firm. We have to make sure this never happens again. People like Sarah shouldn't have the power to tear others down just because they don't fit into their vision of who belongs. Clara smiled slightly. You're right. It's not just about us fixing the company. It's about giving others the chance to succeed on their own merit. That afternoon, James sat down with Thomas Crawford, the CEO, in his office. The tension that had once filled the air with uncertainty had now settled into something more purposeful. Thomas had asked James to meet, and the invitation felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one where James would have a say in how things moved forward. You've done more than I ever expected, James, Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. What you uncovered was something none of us were willing to see. James shifted in his seat, watching the CEO carefully. I don't know if any of us saw it, to be honest, he said. But now that we know, we can't just sweep it under the rug. No, Thomas agreed. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again. What do you think we need to do first? James paused, thinking. Well, first, we need a complete overhaul of the way we recruit and evaluate talent. Diversity isn't just about race or gender. It's about bringing in people with different backgrounds, skills, and experiences. We need to create an environment where anyone, no matter where they come from, can succeed. Thomas nodded. I couldn't agree more. But I'll need your help to make sure this is more than just a change on paper. We need a system in place to hold people accountable. James felt a sense of purpose swell within him. He had always been an outsider, the mechanic in a room full of degree holders. But now, he had the chance to reshape the future of the company, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked because of their background or how they were perceived. I'm in, James said, his voice steady. But we need to get people on board. We need to start with leadership and make sure they know this is a non-negotiable change. Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. I've already had some conversations with the board. They're open to this, but it's going to take time. We'll need to revamp the entire company culture. James smiled slightly. Then let's get started. Over the next few weeks, the company began to change. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of meetings, long hours, and resistance from people who had grown comfortable with the old way of doing things. But for every person who pushed back, there were 5 who were eager to embrace the change. James had the chance to sit in on meetings with the board, where he pushed for a complete overhaul of the recruitment process. The new system would focus on real-world skills, not just resumes. They would prioritize diversity and experience, ensuring that talent from all walks of life would be given the opportunity to thrive. James, can you believe this? Clara said one afternoon as they walked through the office. It's happening. The changes, they're actually happening. James smiled but remained focused. We're not there yet. But we're on the right path. There was one last thing that James knew needed to happen before they could truly move forward. Sarah. He had to face her. It was the last thing he wanted to do, but he knew it was necessary. Sarah had been placed on leave, and there was no doubt that her career at the company was over. But James couldn't just let her slip away without facing the consequences of her actions. He found her in the small, quiet office she had been relegated to since the investigation. Sarah looked different now. Her usual air of confidence had been replaced with a bitter resignation. James, she said, barely looking up when he walked in. I'm sure you're here to rub it in. Well, go ahead. James shook his head. I'm not here for that. You made a lot of people suffer, Sarah. But you're going to have to live with that. I just want you to know that the company is changing. And it's going to keep changing. People won't get pushed aside anymore. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She sat in silence, her hands resting on the desk. You think it's all going to be better now? You think one guy, one mechanic, is going to change everything? James walked to the door, pausing for a moment. No. But we're going to try. And if people like you can't see that, then you're the one who's going to be left behind. With that, he left the office, knowing that this chapter was finally closed. The company, and his life, were ready for the next phase. The weeks that followed Sarah's departure were a whirlwind. James, along with Clara and other key members of the team, dove headfirst into the work of restructuring the company. The first major step was an all-hands meeting with the entire staff, where James had the difficult but necessary task of addressing the culture of exclusion that had been allowed to thrive under Sarah's leadership. Thank you for joining today, James began, standing in front of a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. The energy in the room felt different now. It wasn't just employees waiting for instructions, it felt like a team coming together, ready for change. I know these past few weeks have been hard. But we're here because we believe in something bigger. We believe that this company is capable of being more than just another tech firm. It's about creating something that represents everyone. Every background, every experience, every voice. The room was silent, but the air had shifted. James wasn't just talking about change anymore, he was showing that it had already begun. We're going to implement new systems that focus on real-world skills, diversity of thought, and a work environment that respects each person's contribution, regardless of their background. As James spoke, he could see the skepticism in some eyes. It was natural. Change like this didn't happen overnight, and there would be resistance. But he was ready for it. He wasn't about to let this opportunity slip by, not after everything that had happened. This isn't just about diversity for diversity's sake, James continued, his voice rising with passion. It's about fostering innovation through inclusion. We need people who bring fresh perspectives, people who haven't always had a seat at the table. And that starts now. The first shift in company culture was taking place, not just in the boardrooms but in the hearts of every person in that room. The message was clear, things were changing, and no one would be left behind. Not everyone was happy with the direction the company was heading. After the announcement, James started receiving emails from higher-ups, questioning the speed and scope of the changes. There were murmurs of concern about how fast the company was moving away from the tried-and-true methods that had once worked. It was inevitable. When you stir things up, you create friction. "You're moving too quickly, James," said Mark, the same assistant who had once supported Sarah. He was now one of the vocal critics of the changes. "We've been successful for years. Why change something that works?" James didn't back down. "What's been working hasn't been working for everyone, Mark. We've built a culture that has excluded people. We've stifled innovation. People like Sarah took advantage of that, and I'm not going to let it continue." Mark's eyes narrowed, his posture defensive. "So, what? We just throw everything out and start over?" "This company has a reputation for a reason. And that reputation has limits, Mark," James replied firmly. "It's not about throwing everything away. It's about making sure everyone has a fair shot. That's how we'll grow." While Mark continued to question the changes, James and his team pressed forward. They began to rework the recruitment system, shifting from a traditional model focused solely on academic credentials to a holistic approach that also valued practical experience, problem-solving skills, and collaborative ability. They revamped the interview process to ensure that candidates were judged based on what they could contribute to the company, not just what school they attended. As the company slowly began to embrace the changes, James's efforts were starting to pay off. New hires began trickling in, people who had previously felt like outsiders. They were talented, hungry, and full of ideas. They didn't just fit the mold, they were breaking it and building something new. James's vision of a diverse, inclusive, and innovative workforce was beginning to take shape. But the real test would come when the company was faced with its first major challenge since the shakeup, a project deadline for a new electric vehicle prototype that could potentially revolutionize the market. This time, James would be leading the team, with Clara by his side. They'd hand-picked members of the team, ensuring that a mix of perspectives and skills would be involved. It was a high-stakes project, and if it failed, it could set back the company's reputation once again. "This is it," Clara said one morning as they prepared for the project launch. "Are you ready?" James gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm ready. Let's show them what we're capable of." They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and James could feel the energy in the air. It wasn't just about fixing the prototype. It was about proving that the new approach could lead to groundbreaking results. As the deadline approached, the pressure began to mount. The team was working late into the night, pushing their limits. But despite the intensity of the project, James could sense something different about this team. There was a unity among them, a feeling that they weren't just co-workers, they were part of something bigger. But as the project neared its final stages, disaster struck. "We've hit a wall," Clara said, staring at the screen in front of her. The issue was with the prototype's battery system. The one flaw that could potentially cause the entire vehicle to fail was staring them down. "If we don't figure this out in the next 24 hours, we're done." The clock was ticking, and James could feel the weight of it. The team was tired, but there was no time for rest. "We've been here before," James said, pacing the room. "We'll fix it. We always do. With less than 24 hours left, James and Clara gathered the team for one final push. They went over the blueprints, analyzed every possible flaw, and brainstormed solutions. The clock kept ticking, but the energy in the room had shifted from desperation to determination. "We've got it," one of the engineers shouted just before the deadline. They had found the issue and were able to correct it just in time. The next day, the prototype passed the final test with flying colors. The team had pulled it off. They had done it, against all odds. The car was ready for market, and the potential was massive. When James stood in front of the team, there was a sense of pride that he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about fixing an engine or a project. It was about showing that a new way of thinking, a new way of working, could lead to innovation and success. "We did it," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is just the beginning." The team erupted in cheers, their hard work finally paying off. But as James looked around, he knew that this victory wasn't just about the project. It was about the people. It was about the change that had come from within. The company was no longer the same. And neither was he. James leaned back in his chair, eyes glued to the project timeline. The prototype was a success, but the real test had just begun. They were no longer dealing with just one product, the company was now aiming for market dominance. There were competitors, stakeholders, and investors all waiting for the next big thing, but James knew the stakes had risen even higher. Success could not just be a one-time achievement. "James, we've got a problem," Clara said as she entered his office. James straightened up, already bracing himself. "What happened?" "There's a delay with one of the suppliers for the battery cells," Clara continued, her tone heavy with concern. "We're looking at least 2 more weeks before we can proceed with the final assembly. If we don't get the parts in time, the entire project could be pushed back." James's heart sank. 2 weeks might seem like a minor delay to some, but in the world of tech, 2 weeks could be a lifetime. "What can we do?" James asked, his mind already racing for solutions. The last thing he wanted was another setback. Clara leaned against the desk, thinking. "We could look for alternative suppliers, but they'd need to meet the same quality standards, and there's not much time." James clenched his fists. "We need a solution. We can't afford another delay." The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and stress. James reached out to every possible supplier. Every option he explored came with its own set of challenges, either related to cost, quality, or lead time. He kept pushing forward, refusing to let the team's momentum falter. But even as he fought for a solution, the pressure from the executives and investors was building. "James, we need results," the voice on the other end of the phone crackled. It was Thomas Crawford, the CEO. "Our stakeholders are starting to ask questions. We've invested too much in this to let it slip away." James took a deep breath. "I'm doing everything I can, Thomas. But I won't compromise on quality. We can't rush the process, or we'll end up with another failure." Thomas was silent for a moment before responding. "I know you're trying your best. Just, keep me posted. I'm counting on you." Later that night, James sat at his desk, staring at the supplier reports. "There has to be a way," he muttered to himself, frustration creeping in. But then, something clicked. James stood in the middle of the workshop, his mind racing with possibilities. He had an idea, a bold one, but it might just be crazy enough to work. What if they built the batteries in-house? He turned to Clara, who was scanning the production data. "Clara, I think I've got it." Clara looked up, confused. "What are you thinking?" "We don't have time to wait for suppliers. What if we source the materials ourselves and build the battery cells here? We've got the technical expertise, and we've got the team. We just need the resources." Clara's eyebrows shot up. "You're suggesting we do this ourselves? That's going to take months of development and testing." James shook his head. Not if we work smart. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need a short-term solution to keep this project moving. The next few days were a blur of activity. James worked tirelessly, assembling a small team of engineers and materials experts to see if they could reverse engineer the battery cells needed for the prototype. It was risky, but it was also their only option. Clara was at his side every step of the way, running tests and analyzing the data to ensure they wouldn't fall short. The pressure was suffocating, but James couldn't afford to second-guess himself. "We're pushing the limits here, James," Clara said one evening as they reviewed the latest test results. "If this doesn't work, we're back to square one." James exhaled deeply, looking at the numbers. "I know. But I'm not backing down. We can make this happen." They were still facing an uphill battle. Time was running out, and every decision carried weight. But James refused to let the team's effort go to waste. Failure was not an option. The day before the deadline, James and his team worked late into the night. The final tests on the in-house batteries were ready. It was all or nothing now. "This is it," James muttered as he watched the final diagnostic report. The prototype would either pass the test or it wouldn't. There was no room for error. Clara stood next to him, her face lit by the glow of the screens. "We've done everything we can. All we can do now is wait." James nodded. The final test would determine if their hard work would pay off, or if they would lose it all. They watched as the battery charged. The clock ticked down. The silence was deafening. "It's working," Clara whispered in disbelief. The battery was holding up, perfectly. The prototype was functional. James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had done it. The prototype was ready. It was a triumph not just of technology, but of sheer will. James's team had faced setbacks, pressure, and doubt, but they had come through, against all odds. When they presented the working prototype to the investors and stakeholders, there was no longer any doubt. The project was a success. The car was ready for the market. And for James, this victory was more than just about the product. It was about redemption. It was about proving that his way of thinking, his approach to innovation, diversity, and inclusion, was what had made this success possible. As the team celebrated their victory, Clara pulled James aside. "You did it," she said with a smile. "You really changed everything." James grinned back at her, but there was a sense of calm in his expression. "We did it. Together." As James stood in the company's now bustling innovation lab, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had gone from being the outsider, the underdog, to the leader of a company on the verge of revolutionizing the electric vehicle market. But the journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new projects, and new battles to fight. But James knew one thing for sure. The company was now a place where anyone could succeed, regardless of their background or experience. And that was the foundation for a future full of possibilities. "Let's make sure the door is always open for the next generation," James said to Clara, as they looked out over the lab, filled with the hum of machines and innovation. The success of the electric vehicle prototype had set the company on a new trajectory. The work James and his team had done, the long hours, the innovations, the breakthroughs, were now paying off in ways they never imagined. But with success came greater responsibility. "We've got investors knocking down our doors, James," Clara said one morning, handing him a report. "They're already talking about scaling up production, expanding to new markets. There's a lot of pressure to keep this momentum going." James took the report, scanning the figures and projections. The numbers were high, and the potential was undeniable, but so were the risks. "We need to be careful," James replied, looking up at her. "This is a big leap. Scaling up too quickly can stretch us thin. We've got to make sure we're ready." Clara nodded. "I agree. But we also can't afford to wait too long. The market is moving fast. If we don't seize this moment, we'll lose our edge. It was a delicate balance. James had led the team to this point, but now, he faced an entirely new challenge, managing growth without losing sight of the values that had gotten them here. The same principles of inclusion, innovation, and quality that had made their product a success needed to be the foundation of their expansion. The pressure to deliver was undeniable. James spent more time in meetings with investors, discussing projections, expansion plans, and the complexities of increasing production. Meanwhile, his team continued to work on refining the vehicle's design and improving battery efficiency. But with every conversation about scaling came a new challenge. How could they maintain their commitment to diversity and inclusion while rapidly expanding? "James, we need to talk about recruitment," Clara said one afternoon, as she and James sat down to review their hiring strategy. "If we're going to scale, we need to ensure that we bring in more diverse talent. It's not just about meeting quotas, it's about making sure the people we bring in contribute to the culture we've built here." James rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Exactly. The last thing we need is to lose sight of the values that made us strong. We need to continue bringing in people from all backgrounds who bring something different to the table. If we don't, we risk falling into the same patterns that we fought against before." Clara nodded. "We can't afford to go back to a culture of exclusion. But we also need to make sure that the new hires are aligned with our mission. It's a tightrope walk." The conversations with investors became increasingly complex, with expectations growing higher by the day. James had to carefully navigate between bold decisions and calculated risks. But one thing was clear, he wasn't about to let the company's foundation crumble under pressure. As the weeks passed, James found himself in a constant balancing act. Scaling the company's operations was proving more challenging than he had anticipated. He was spending more time in meetings, and less time on the floor with the team. But he knew he couldn't let go completely. The heart of the company was still the people, the engineers, the innovators, the thinkers who had made this success possible in the first place. One evening, after a long day of meetings, James stood on the rooftop of the company's office, overlooking the city below. The view was breathtaking, but his mind wasn't on the skyline. It was on the future. "We've come so far," James muttered to himself, watching the sun set. "But this is just the beginning." The work wasn't over. There was more to do, more to create, more to build. But he had the team. He had the vision. And now, more than ever, he had the opportunity to shape the future. The next day, James sat down with Thomas Crawford once more. The conversation was different this time, not about crisis management or overcoming sabotage, but about sustainability. The company had proven it could innovate and lead, but now it needed to do so responsibly. "James, we've discussed expansion, but I think it's time we set a clear direction for the future," Thomas said. "What's next for us? What's our legacy going to be?" James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. He had always focused on the immediate challenges, but now, the question of legacy seemed more pressing. "We've got to make sure that we continue to be a company that stands for something," James replied, looking Thomas in the eye. "Innovation doesn't just mean creating something new. It means creating something that matters, something that makes a difference in people's lives. And I believe we can do that. We can lead in the tech industry, and at the same time, we can build a culture that encourages fairness, equality, and opportunity for all." "That's the vision we need," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I'm with you, James. Let's make sure we do this right." And with that, the vision for the company's future began to solidify. It was no longer just about the technology they were building, it was about how they were going to build it, and who they were going to bring along for the ride. As the company continued to grow, James never lost sight of what truly mattered. The product, the innovation, and the technology were important, but the people were everything. He made sure that every decision he made was informed by the principles that had gotten him this far: diversity, inclusion, and innovation. Months later, at the launch event for the next generation of their electric vehicle, James stood before the crowd, watching the reactions of investors, clients, and employees. The product was a success, but what struck him most was the faces in the crowd, a reflection of the company's new direction. It wasn't just about the tech anymore. It was about the people who were driving it forward. "This is just the beginning," James said, speaking to the crowd. "We've proven that we can create something amazing. But what's most important is that we've created a space where anyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a place to succeed." The crowd erupted in applause, but James didn't focus on the cheers. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of the diverse team that had helped build this future. They were the ones who had made this possible, and they were the ones who would carry the company forward. As James walked off the stage, he realized that the journey had come full circle. The underdog, the outsider, had become a leader, not just in innovation, but in building something that mattered. James's journey was one of challenges, setbacks, and ultimately, transformation. From the first engine he fixed to the massive scale-up of the company, he had not only revolutionized technology but had also redefined the very culture of the workplace. Innovation, yes. But more importantly, opportunity for all. James had built more than just a successful product. He had built a legacy, a company that would continue to innovate and lead, but most importantly, a company that would always make room for people from all backgrounds to succeed. And with that, James knew that the story of his company was far from over. The best was yet to come.